On the evening of September 25th, inside the towering marble halls of the United Nations, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Flags of 193 nations lined the chamber like a forest of colors, each one claiming equality, though everyone in that room knew some flags carried weight, while others were treated as decoration. At the center of it all stood a young soldier from a landlocked country, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Barely in his 30s, he was handed a script that was not his own, a 12-page confession drafted in foreign capitals Paris, Washington, Tel Aviv. It accused his nation of destabilization, demanded an apology, and was meant to humiliate him before the world. The cameras were already rolling. Western delegates leaned forward, expecting submission. African delegations straightened in their seats, hoping for defiance, but fearing betrayal. Millions of eyes beyond the hall followed his every move. Would he bow his head, accept the humiliation, and return quietly to the shadows of history, or would he stand not just for himself, but for every voice that had been silenced across Africa for centuries? The silence that filled the General Assembly was heavier than thunder. In that single instant, the question became larger than one man or one nation. Was this the fall of a young president, or the birth of a symbol? And if your ancestors could see this moment, would they call it surrender, or the first breath of freedom? This is not a story of ceremony. This is the story of defiance, the story of how a carefully staged humiliation became one of the boldest indictments of the modern era. And tonight I want to ask you, do you believe Africa's freedom must still wait for permission, or has the time already come to seize it? Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that truth is always more powerful than headlines. The 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly had followed its usual script of speeches, protocols, and rehearsed applause. But as the evening shadows lengthened over New York, all attention shifted to one podium. The lectern, polished smooth by decades of world leaders, held a file of 12 crisp pages bearing the insignia of the United Nations. To most delegates, it looked like any other document. To Ibrahim Traoré, it was a trap. That file, prepared not in Ouagadougou, but in Paris, Washington, and Tel Aviv, was designed to humiliate. It accused Burkina Faso of destabilizing the Sahel, obstructing international peace, and undermining cooperation. It demanded acknowledgement, apology, and surrender. For those who drafted it, the logic was simple: force the young president to read it aloud, and his rebellion against foreign dictates would collapse before the entire world. Inside the chamber, the tension was palpable. Western diplomats leaned forward, certain they were about to witness his submission. Many African delegations sat in anxious silence, hoping he would defy the script, yet fearing betrayal. For weeks, rumors had spread that Traoré, barely past his mid-30s, was reckless, naive, and too inexperienced to endure the pressures of global politics. This moment, they believed, would break him. The cameras zoomed in. Translators pressed their headsets closer, prepared to repeat every word. Journalists scribbled, assuming they were already chronicling a public confession. The hall grew so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Every heartbeat felt like a verdict waiting to be read. When Traoré entered the chamber, he wore not a statesman's robe, nor a suit tailored for diplomacy, but a plain military uniform. No medals, no ornaments, just the attire of a soldier. In his hands, he carried no notes of his own, only the file placed before him. His steps were steady, his face calm but unreadable. As he adjusted the microphone, its echo rippled through the hall, amplifying the suspense. Would he pick up the document and recite its words? Would he sign his own submission before the watching world? Or would he dare to discard the script of humiliation and replace it with one of his own? For a long second, Traoré looked down at the file. To those watching, it seemed as though he might lift it, unfold its pages, and let the humiliation proceed. But then came the moment that shifted history. With deliberate calm, he closed the file, pressing it flat against the wood of the lectern. He would not read it. That single act sent a ripple across the chamber. It was quiet, no grand gesture, no defiant shout. Yet in that silence, the entire balance of power shifted. The defendant had just rejected the prosecutor's script. A young president from one of the poorest, most overlooked nations had refused to bow before the giants of the world. The room froze. Western delegations exchanged uneasy glances. Some scribbled furiously as if their pens could cover the weight of the rejection. African delegations sat straighter, a mix of relief and pride rising in their chests. And in millions of homes around the world, viewers felt the tension ignite. For Traore, this was not simply defiance. His very presence at that podium was the continuation of a line drawn through history, through Patrice Lumumba, through Thomas Sankara, through every African leader who had been silenced before his time. To read that confession would have been to betray them. To close it was to honor their unfinished work. And so in that moment the story turned. What was meant to be a public surrender became the prologue to something else entirely, an indictment, not of Burkina Faso, but of the powers that had written those 12 pages. The silence was not ordinary silence, it was the hush before a storm. When the file was pressed shut against the lectern, the chamber of the United Nations shifted from ceremony to judgment. The silence that followed was not empty, it was the silence of anticipation of a storm gathering, and then Ibrahim Traoré spoke. His words began steady, almost restrained. "Let us speak," he said, "of the first great crime." The hall leaned in, expecting a careful apology. Instead, they received an indictment. He began with the transatlantic slave trade, reminding the world that over 12 million Africans had been ripped from their homes, shackled in iron, and sold across oceans. The foundations of Western wealth, cotton, sugar, coffee were built not on fair trade, but on blood. Delegates shifted in their seats. Translators hesitated, their voices catching on phrases that carried centuries of memory. This was not diplomacy. It was accusation. The second crime, financial slavery. He cited the CFA franc, a colonial relic that forced African nations to deposit half their reserves in the French treasury, more than 500 billion withheld from African hands. His voice cut through the chamber sharp as a blade. The French delegation avoided eye contact, their silence betraying unease. Then, Rwanda. The genocide of 1994, 800,000 lives lost in just 100 days. Traoré did not flinch in naming France as protector of those who carried out the killings. The atmosphere thickened. To speak so directly within these halls was almost unthinkable, yet he continued relentless. The fourth crime, debt. Africa's external burden surpassing $685 billion, with nearly $90 billion due in repayments this very year. "We borrow not to live but to survive," he declared, "and our children die not from illness, but from the price of medicine." His words fell like hammers, each syllable an indictment backed by numbers too brutal to ignore. The crimes flowed one after another, building in intensity. The destruction of agriculture, Ghanaian cocoa farmers ruined, while corporations like Nestlé and Cargill amassed billions. The murder of African leaders Patrice Lumumba in 1961, Thomas Sankara in 1987, silenced for daring to speak of dignity. The Cold War, when dictators were armed while their people starved. The poisoning of the Niger Delta by oil giants ExxonMobil and total condemning millions to toxic soil and shortened lives. The proliferation of foreign military bases, 29 American, 10 French planted like chains across African soil. And finally, the manipulation of human rights, Zimbabwe condemned, Sudan sanctioned, while client states like Chad and Gabon were spared. For them, he thundered, human rights are not principles, they are weapons. By the time his 10th charge fell into the chamber, the atmosphere had transformed. The hall was no longer a theater of polite speeches, it had become a courtroom. And the West, long accustomed to judging others, now stood accused. Yet Traoré was not finished. His eyes swept across the delegations. He called names. Emmanuel Macron, you inherit not merely a presidency, but an empire of colonizers. The French delegation stiffened. Donald Trump, you turn trade and oil into bargaining chips bought with blood. You claim greatness, but it is paid with suffering not your own. American diplomats froze, expressionless, their silence louder than words. Then his voice struck at finance itself. To the directors of the International Monetary Fund, you wear the mask of development, but you are wardens of a financial prison. The chamber could barely contain the weight of his words. Western diplomats avoided one another's eyes. Some scribbled frantically as if notes could shield them from accusation. Others sat rigid, hands, folded faces pale. Across the African bloc, shoulders straightened and eyes sharpened. For them, the silence was victory. There was no applause when he finished this litany. There was no outburst. Only silence heavier than thunder, deeper than any roar. A silence that testified the truth could not be denied. A silence that crowned defiance with dignity. The United Nations moved quickly to contain the moment. Within hours, officials quietly announced that Traoré's speech would not be entered into the official record, citing procedural irregularities. But censorship in the digital age is fragile. By nightfall, the full transcript had leaked online, spreading across social media like fire-meeting dry brush. In Nairobi, students projected his words onto the walls of their universities. In Lagos, taxi drivers replayed clips of his defiance on crackling radios. In Dakar and Johannesburg, young people painted murals of his silhouette in uniform captioned with the words, "We ask for no pity. We demand justice." For them, this was not just politics. It was memory, reclaimed dignity, spoken aloud after decades of silence. Across the diaspora, the reaction was just as electric. In Paris, African youth marched past the Eiffel Tower carrying placards that read, "Traoré speaks for us." In London, chants of "No more chains" echoed through Trafalgar Square. In New York and Washington, African-American leaders drew direct connections to the civil rights era, reading his words in churches in Atlanta and Detroit as though they were scripture. Harlem community leaders told congregations that the dignity of Africa was inseparable from their own. This wave of resonance was not confined to symbolic acts. In Latin America, activists invoked Traoré's indictment as inspiration for their own struggles against debt and exploitation. In Asia, editorial writers suggested his defiance marked proof that the world was no longer unipolar. Even in Europe, among marginalized immigrant communities, his speech circulated like forbidden truth shared in hushed voices on trains, whispered in late-night gatherings. But alongside celebration came unease. In Washington, think tanks analysts warned that a dangerous precedent had been set. If a small, landlocked nation like Burkina Faso could defy the script, what would stop Ghana, Senegal, or even South Africa from doing the same? European diplomats whispered about the possibility of coordinated African demands, perhaps reparations, perhaps collective resistance to debt payments. For the first time in decades, the West was on the defensive. Inside Africa, the aftershocks were even more profound. Leaders who could not applaud in New York began to choose their words more carefully at home. Some praised Traoré openly as Sankara's heir, a young soldier who had turned the courtroom of history against its former judges. Others, however, grew uneasy. His defiance, while inspiring, also threatened to ignite fires they could not control. For regimes still tied to Western powers, Traoré's example was both a symbol of pride and a reminder of their own vulnerability. Among ordinary people, the sense of awakening was undeniable. Market traders spoke his name as though it carried the weight of currency. Cocoa farmers in Ghana repeated his words, "When our farmers fall, their corporations rise." Refugee children in camps chanted his phrases as if they were songs. Across the continent, dignity itself seemed to have found a spokesman, and then came the phrase that captured imaginations, the union of black gold. At first it was dismissed as metaphor, but within weeks it became a rallying cry. Was black gold oil cocoa minerals, or was it Africa's people, their resilience, their culture? Hashtags bearing the phrase surged in Swahili, Yoruba, Wolof, and Zulu. At rallies from Lagos to Lusaka, banners declared, "Black gold is us." What had begun as a staged humiliation had transformed into something far greater, a seed of collective possibility. A sense that Africa could negotiate not as fragments, but as one. A recognition that even the poorest nation could stand at the podium of the world and rewrite the script. In Washington, Traoré's words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through every corridor of power. Within hours, think tanks were drafting urgent memos. Analysts warned that if Burkina Faso could speak so boldly, others might follow. A congressional aide admitted uneasily to mention Donald Trump by name in that hall. That was no slip. It was a calculated strike. Publicly, the State Department offered only a bland reaffirmation of America's commitment to partnership with Africa. Privately, officials spoke of a dangerous precedent. The silence of the General Assembly they feared might echo into a chorus. Could Ghana, Senegal, or even South Africa begin refusing the language of aid and dependency? Could African nations demand reparations or debt cancellation with the same unapologetic defiance? American media struggled to frame the moment. Some outlets dismissed Traoré's performance as reckless theatrics from a young, untested leader. Others, more cautious, acknowledged the gravity of his historical claims. On cable news, debates raged late into the night. Was he a destabilizer or the only one willing to voice truths the West preferred to forget? For older viewers, echoes of the Cold War resurfaced, Khrushchev pounding a shoe, Castro defying the empire, Mandela raising his fist. For younger audiences, it felt like a page torn from a new chapter of history. Across Europe, reactions were fractured. In Paris, officials downplayed the accusations, but their discomfort during the speech had already spoken volumes. French media noted his defiance, but struggled to respond without reigniting old colonial wounds. In Brussels, diplomats whispered nervously about the danger of African unity moving from rhetoric to policy. A coordinated bloc resisting debt payments or demanding reparations could shake the global financial order. In the Global South, the response was altogether different. In Latin America, activists compared Traoré's rhetoric to Bolivar's dream of dignity and independence. His words were invoked at rallies against IMF-imposed austerity. In Asia, commentators argued the speech was proof that the world had entered a truly multipolar era. Newspapers in India, Malaysia, and Indonesia suggested that Africa's voice had finally joined the chorus reshaping global power. Even in Europe itself, among marginalized immigrant communities, his speech circulated underground. Shared on phones, whispered on trains, passed quietly in community centers, it became a forbidden truth, a spark of recognition that the struggles of Africa were inseparable from those of the global poor. But not all responses were celebratory. In Western policy circles, whispers of retaliation spread. Could sanctions be used to punish Burkina Faso? Would financial pressure or covert destabilization return, as it had with Lumumba and Sankara? The question lingered in every analysis: how long before bold defiance attracts deadly consequences? Yet whatever the strategies behind closed doors, one fact remained undeniable: the speech could not be buried. It had already crossed borders, taken root in minds, and reshaped conversations. The West had hoped for submission, but was left facing a movement. For the first time in decades, Africa was not on the defensive. The world was. When the cameras caught Ibrahim Traoré leaving the United Nations that night, the image traveled faster than any speech. A young soldier in a plain uniform walking past marble pillars, the file of 12 pages still tucked under his arm. It was meant to be a confession of weakness. Instead, it became the most defiant indictment of an era. Commentators compared the photograph to Mandela's raised fist, to Nkrumah declaring independence, to Sankara standing unbowed. In one night, a man from one of Africa's poorest nations had carved his likeness into the gallery of symbols. His closing words echoed like steel: "We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it." In those words lived four truths: dignity, memory, courage, and identity. Dignity: that true strength is found not in recognition, but in refusing to bow. Memory: that the past is not erased, but breathes through generations. Courage: that a single honest voice can carry farther than 1,000 empty declarations. Identity: that freedom begins the moment we stop imitating and start embracing who we are. Yet history reminds us courage alone does not guarantee survival. Lumumba was silenced. Sankara was assassinated. Every act of defiance carries the shadow of retaliation. Already whispers of sanctions and plots swirl in foreign capitals. Already allies and adversaries weigh whether Traoré's flame will unite Africa or whether it will be extinguished before it spreads too far. And still the question refuses to fade. Was September 25th the dawn of a new order, or the spark of confrontation yet to come? Will the Union of Black Gold become a living strategy, 54 nations negotiating as one, or remain a slogan painted on walls and shouted in rallies? What is certain is this: after that night, the world can no longer pretend Africa will sit silently. Whether in triumph or in tragedy, the silence of the chamber has already given way to the noise of the streets, the songs of students, the chants of diaspora. To you, the listener, the challenge is personal. Will you let this moment pass as just another headline forgotten by tomorrow's news cycle? Or will you carry it forward as a vow that justice cannot wait for permission, that freedom belongs to those who claim it? If his words moved you, leave one word in the comments: justice, freedom, black gold. Let the world see which flame you carry. Please share if you believe you are among the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that truth is always more powerful than headlines.